tension. On February 28th, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran under Operation Epic Fury, killing Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, and Iran did not fold. Despite Trump's claim that Iran's military capability had been 100% destroyed, Tehran has defied that assertion, continuing strikes that have nearly halted shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, sending oil prices up 40% and shaking the global economy. Now here's where it gets deeply alarming for you, for your savings, for your cost of living. Iran's Joint Military Command announced it would start targeting banks and financial institutions in the Middle East, putting at risk particularly Dubai, which is home to many international financial institutions, as well as Saudi Arabia and the island kingdom of Bahrain. Major firms including Citi, Deloitte, and PwC evacuated or closed offices in Dubai's financial district. Goldman Sachs told employees they must obtain approval before entering any Middle East offices. Standard Chartered asked staff near the Dubai International Financial Center to leave. Total commercial bank deposits in the GCC reached $2.3 trillion last year, a significant portion held by non-residents. Dubai alone handles 15% of the world's gold trade. This isn't a regional banking story. This is a stress fracture running through the spine of global finance. Before February 28th of this year, there were an average of 138 ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz every single day. Think about that number for a moment. 138 ships, day in, day out, carrying the lifeblood of the global industrial economy. Oil, liquefied natural gas, fertilizers, helium, industrial chemicals, flowing through a narrow stretch of water barely 21 miles wide at its most constricted point. Since the war began, no more than 5 ships have been passing through each day. 5. From 138 to 5. That is not a disruption, that is a shutdown, and the consequences of that shutdown are now radiating outward from the Persian Gulf into every grocery store, every gas station, every household budget, and every central bank balance sheet on Earth. Let's walk through exactly how we got here, because the American media is not giving you the full picture. In late December 2025, massive nationwide anti-government protests erupted inside Iran, originally driven by economic discontent, escalating into explicit calls to overthrow the Islamic Republic. Those protests became the largest in scale since the 1979 revolution. Meanwhile, in January 2026, US and European officials said Washington had presented Iran with 3 core demands, one of which was a permanent end to all uranium enrichment. Iran did not comply. And then at the State of the Union address, President Trump stated that Iran had restarted its nuclear program and was developing missiles capable of striking the United States. Days later, the International Atomic Energy Agency discovered hidden highly enriched uranium in an underground facility. The stage was set. What happened next was not a surprise to anyone watching closely. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel initiated coordinated airstrikes on Iran under Operation Epic Fury, targeting military facilities, nuclear sites, and leadership, resulting in the death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Now, here is something worth sitting with. The killing of a supreme leader, a man who had ruled an entire nation's military, foreign policy, and theological direction for nearly 4 decades, is not a small thing. This is the kind of action that doesn't just end a conflict, it transforms it. It makes it personal, it makes it existential, and Iran, whatever you may think about its government, is a nation of 90 million people with a sophisticated military establishment, a network of proxy forces across an entire region, and the geographic fortune, or misfortune, depending on which side you're on, of sitting right next to the single most critical energy choke point on the planet. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, broke his silence days after succeeding his slain father. In a message read by a news anchor on state television, Khamenei declared that the Strait of Hormuz should remain closed and that Iran will continue attacks on its Persian Gulf neighbors. This is the crucial moment that the American establishment did not fully anticipate. They assumed that decapitating Iranian leadership would produce a swift capitulation. What it actually produced was a new, younger, and seemingly more hardline supreme leader with every political and theological incentive to prove he is not weaker than his father, and every military instrument to demonstrate that point in real time. So let's talk about what Iran has actually done, because this is where the story gets complicated in ways that a lot of American commentators are glossing over. Just 2 days into the war, Iran began targeting the biggest oil and gas assets in the Persian Gulf, launching missiles and drones at ports, pipelines, and processing units. This wasn't random retaliation. This was a carefully constructed economic strategy. Iran looked at the situation and concluded rationally that the way to bring Washington to the table is not through a direct military confrontation it cannot win, but through economic pain that becomes politically unbearable inside the United States, and it is working, at least in part. Operations were suspended at Saudi Arabia's largest oil refinery, Aramco's Ras Tanura plant, following an Iranian drone strike in the area. Ras Tanura is not just any refinery, it is the crown jewel of Saudi Arabia's downstream capacity. When that facility goes offline, the ripple effects move across global markets within hours, and that's exactly what happened. Kuwait, the fifth biggest producer in OPEC, announced precautionary cuts to its oil production and refinery output due to Iranian threats against safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz. Iraq's production from its three main southern oil fields has fallen 70%, dropping to 1.3 million barrels per day from 4.3 million before the war. Let that sink in. Iraq's production, from some of the richest fields in the world, has effectively collapsed by more than two-thirds. The United Arab Emirates said it was carefully managing offshore production levels due to storage limitations. And Qatar, which supplies a massive portion of the world's liquefied natural gas, declared force majeure on gas contracts. Qatar's energy minister Saad Al-Kaabi warned that if the war continues, other Gulf energy producers may be forced to halt exports and declare force majeure, stating that this will bring down economies of the world. That is not a fringe voice, that is the energy minister of one of the world's most important gas-producing nations using the phrase "bring down economies of the world" in a public statement. And yet, in Washington, the dominant narrative remained, at least initially, that this was all manageable, that Iran had been decimated, that it would all be over quickly. The reality on the ground and in the water has been very different. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth called one particular day the most intense day of U.S. strikes in Iran. That same day, Tehran unleashed its own wave of attacks against Israel and the Persian Gulf. And President Trump threatened Iran with death, fire, and fury if Iran kept blocking the key Strait of Hormuz. Tehran hit back, vowing it would not allow 1 liter of oil to leave the Middle East until US and Israeli attacks cease. This is a classic escalatory spiral, and the problem with escalatory spirals is that each side's response becomes the justification for the other side's next action. There is no natural floor in this kind of dynamic unless one side either wins decisively or decides the cost is too high to continue. Now here is the piece that most American coverage has missed or underplayed or buried at the bottom of the article. A spokesperson for the Qatam al-Anbiya headquarters, which is affiliated with Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, stated, "The enemy left our hands open to targeting economic centers and banks belonging to the United States and the Zionist regime in the region. This is a direct public declaration that Iran is now targeting the financial architecture of the Gulf, not just oil fields, not just military bases, banks, financial institutions, the treasury and trading operations that keep the global economy connected." The IRGC-affiliated Tasnim news agency released a list of US tech giants including Google, Microsoft, Palantir, IBM, Nvidia, and Oracle as key targets due to their involvement in military applications used by Israel. Think about what it means for the global economy when Iran announces that data centers and cloud computing infrastructure, the backbone of modern digital commerce, are now legitimate military targets. We are not talking about a conflict that stays neatly within the borders of the Middle East. We are talking about a conflict that is reaching toward the central nervous system of the global financial and technological order, and the private sector responded to this threat instantly and viscerally. Goldman Sachs told employees they must obtain approval before going to offices across the Middle East. Standard Chartered asked staff near the Dubai International Financial Center to leave offices. Several banks urged their employees to evacuate offices in Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. HSBC closed all its branches in Qatar until further notice. When Goldman Sachs and HSBC start evacuating their Gulf offices, you are no longer watching a regional conflict. You are watching a stress test of the entire global financial system in real time. Dubai is not just a city of skyscrapers and luxury shopping. It is a critical node in the world's financial plumbing, a place where capital flows between East and West, where energy contracts are settled, where the balance sheets of major multinationals are managed. The Iranian threat against financial institutions came after a Tehran location of Bank Sepa, the state-owned financial institution sanctioned by the US over funding Iranian armed forces, came under attack, killing staffers there. In the logic of escalation, Iran's response was proportional. If they kill our bankers, we will target your financial centers. That logic may be coherent in a military sense and utterly catastrophic in an economic one. Now let's bring this home to you, to your life, your costs, your economic reality as an American. Gas prices have surged by 50 cents a gallon, going from $2.98 before the war started to $3.48 on March 10th. In the second week of March, California's gasoline prices exceeded $5 per gallon. And this is still the early phase of the conflict. Economists warn that the key thresholds for a recession are oil prices at $125 a barrel, gas prices at $4.25 a gallon, and inflation at 4% a year. We are not at those thresholds yet, but we are moving toward them faster than most Americans realize, and the direction of travel depends almost entirely on how long this conflict continues. Every sustained $10 a barrel increase in oil prices could cost the typical U.S. household close to an extra $450 annually, according to Moody's Analytics chief economist Mark Zandi. Oil has already moved up by more than $40 from its pre-war level. You can do that math yourself. We are talking about something approaching $1,800 in additional annual costs hitting the average American family. Not from a tax increase, not from a trade war, but from a conflict that the United States chose to initiate and is now struggling to conclude on favorable terms. The war is costing the U.S. an estimated $1 billion a day, according to two congressional sources with knowledge of the matter. $1 billion a day, that money doesn't appear from nowhere. It adds to the deficit, it adds to the debt, it eventually adds to the tax burden or the inflation burden, or both. If the war lasts more than a few weeks, observers say the U.S. economy is more likely to see deepening impacts like 1970s style stagflation or a recession. The International Energy Agency said in a report that the war in the Middle East is creating the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market, the largest in history, not since the 1973 oil embargo, not since the 1979 Iranian Revolution. In the entire recorded history of the global oil market, nothing has disrupted supply the way this conflict is doing right now. And the Federal Reserve, the institution that Americans have relied upon to manage economic crises, finds itself in an almost impossible position. Higher oil prices feed inflation as well as hurting the economy. If the Fed lowers rates to give the economy a lift, inflation gets worse. If it raises rates to curb inflation, it slows hiring. That combination of high inflation plus high unemployment is just really tough for the Fed to deal with, one economist told Al Jazeera. The Strait of Hormuz has to be reopened, stated economist Simon Johnson of MIT and recipient of the 2024 Nobel Prize in Economics. It's 20 million barrels of oil a day going through there. There is no excess capacity anywhere in the world that can fill that gap, he explained. This is the central reality that no amount of strategic petroleum reserve releases, no amount of diplomatic announcements, no amount of presidential social media posts can change. 20 million barrels a day. The reserve releases that Trump announced, the International Energy Agency coordinated the release of 400 million barrels from global emergency reserves in a historic move to try to lower prices. Sound impressive. But 400 million barrels, spread across the global market, amounts to roughly 20 days of the flow that the Strait was carrying before it was shut down. It's a band-aid on a broken artery. Kuwait reported its international airport was targeted by several drones. Bahrain told residents to stay inside and close windows after an attack in Muharraq Governorate. Kuwait's electricity ministry said 6 power transmission lines went out of service after debris from intercepted drones fell on them. These are not distant, abstract events. Bahrain is home to the United States Navy's 5th Fleet. Kuwait hosts Camp Arifjan, one of the most critical U.S. military logistics hubs in the entire Middle East. When Iranian drones are taking out power transmission lines in Kuwait and sending residents of Bahrain indoors, the operational geography of this entire conflict is shifting in ways that have direct consequences for American military capability in the region. A more severe scenario in which the conflict persists for several months could see oil prices rise to around 130s per barrel before declining in the second half of the year. The Eurozone economy would probably contract in Q2 and then flatline. The Federal Reserve could abandon rate cuts while the European Central Bank could move to raise interest rates. These are not the projections of alarmists. These are the sober assessments of Chatham House economists, people paid to be measured and conservative in their language. And even in their measured, conservative assessment, a prolonged conflict produces a Federal Reserve that stops cutting rates, a Eurozone that contracts, and an American economy whose growth prospects shrink considerably. Stagflation is the combination of high inflation stemming from energy prices, higher unemployment, with the jobless rate at 4.4% according to the latest Bureau of Labor Statistics report, and jobs reports continuing to be weak, and stagnating economic growth. The Q4 2025 GDP figure fell to 1.4% growth. That 1.4% growth figure before this war started was already a warning sign. The US economy was not entering this conflict from a position of robust strength. It was entering it already slowing, already carrying the weight of years of elevated interest rates, already showing cracks in the labor market, and now it is absorbing the largest oil supply disruption in recorded history on top of all of that. Here is the power structure. Nobody in the main American media wants to ask directly. Who fit from this conflict? Not the American consumer, who is paying more for gas and groceries. The American worker, whose job prospects with every week of elevated oil prices. Gulf Arab states that were supposed to be allies, but are watching their oil fields get struck, their banks evacuated, their financial... Iran is targeting economic military sites in Israel, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Jordan, Oman, and Bahrain. It has also struck Cyprus and Azerbaijan. The geographics are extraordinary. This is not a localized military engagement. This is a regional war with global economic consequences that is not contracting. The UN approve a resolution demanding a halt to Iran's attacks on its Gulf neighbors, passing China and Russia, too, abstained from the vote. Their ambassadors called the proposal extremely unbalanced, in not mentioning the strikes against Iran that began the war. The China-Russia abstention is not a small footnote. Moscow apply pressure on Tehran. They have every the United States aerially and financially watch it get tested by and watch America's Gulf Arab partners lose confidence in American security guarantees. The Kremlin said discussions are taking place between Moscow and Washington about ways of cooperating to help stabilize energy markets. It is obvious that interaction between Russia and the United States, including on energy markets, could and should be an important factor in stabilizing those markets, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said. Russia is now positioning itself as an indispensable energy market stabilizer at the precise moment when American-led military action has destabilized those markets. That is not coincidence. That is strategy. For a long time, the nightmare scenario that deterred the US from considering an attack on Iran and which got them to urge restraint on Israel was that the Iranians would close the Strait of Hormuz, said Maurice Obstfeld, a former chief economist at the IMF. Now we're in the nightmare scenario. Those are the words of one of the most senior economists ever to serve at the International Monetary Fund. Now we're in the nightmare scenario. The scenario that for decades served as the ultimate deterrent against military action in the Persian Gulf, the scenario that strategic planners wargamed and consistently concluded was too economically catastrophic to risk, is now the present reality. The nightmare is no longer a planning exercise, it is happening in real time, and the world is trying to improvise its way through it. For decades, policymakers spoke about this possibility in cautious, theoretical language as something that must never be allowed to happen because the economic shock would ripple instantly across the entire global system. That hypothetical scenario, the one that lived inside reports, simulations, and closed-door policy briefings, is no longer hypothetical. The nightmare scenario that once lived in forecasts and contingency plans has crossed the line from analysis into reality. For years, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz was treated as the ultimate red line in strategic thinking, the point at which military escalation would stop because the economic consequences were simply too severe. The Strait is one of the most important arteries of the global economy, the narrow passage through which a massive share of the world's oil supply must pass every single day. When planners imagined it closing, they imagined panic in energy markets, violent price spikes, and a chain reaction moving through global finance, trade, and food systems. That is precisely why it functioned as a deterrent. Everyone understood that once the nightmare began, it would be extremely difficult to control the consequences. Yet now the world finds itself in precisely that situation, confronting the very scenario that policymakers once treated as the absolute worst case. The nightmare is no longer an academic exercise or a scenario on a whiteboard. It is unfolding moment by moment while governments and markets attempt to adapt in real time. Every 10% increase in oil prices, provided they persist for most of the year,
will push up global inflation by 0.4% and reduce worldwide economic output by as much as 0.2%, said Kristalina Georgieva, managing director of the IMF. Oil prices have risen by more than 40% since the war began. Apply that math. We are looking at the potential for a 1.6% increase in global inflation and up to a 0.8% reduction in global economic output, if prices stay at current levels for the rest of the year. Those numbers sound small until you remember that global GDP is measured in the tens of trillions of dollars and that a 0.8% reduction in global output represents an enormous destruction of human economic welfare, concentrated most painfully among the people least able to absorb it. The impact is not evenly distributed. It moves through the global economy in waves, and each wave strikes hardest where households already live closest to the financial edge. The UN World Food Programme and various economic analysts have warned that the 2026 military escalation in Iran is driving significant long-term increases in global food prices, because oil is not just gasoline. Oil is in the fertilizers that grow crops. Oil is in the shipping containers that move food. Oil is in the plastic packaging that preserves it. When oil goes up, everything goes up, and the people who feel it first and hardest are the ones who spend the largest share of their income on food and basic goods. A spike in energy costs quickly becomes a spike in transportation costs, agricultural costs, and manufacturing costs, and those increases cascade through every layer of the global supply chain. The result is that higher oil prices quietly translate into higher prices for bread, rice, cooking oil, and basic household staples in markets around the world. And for millions of families who already allocate most of their income simply to eat and survive, even small increases in those prices can become devastating. This is the true geometry of this conflict, and this is why the banking story, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, the UAE, the evacuation of financial institutions from Dubai to Doha, matters so profoundly. Because the global economy does not run on oil alone,